They had already accepted the bread, and they had grown used to the coffee that never seemed to end. But there was another detail that unsettled them even more because it contradicted everything they believed they knew about scarcity during wartime. On their trays, meat appeared again and again, not as a rare exception, not carefully measured, and not accompanied by any explanation that might suggest restraint. For men who had learned to associate meat with absence, with substitutes, and with memories rather than reality, this routine felt impossible to understand. In a world shaped by shortages, this detail raised a question they could not easily answer, and once they noticed it, they could not stop watching for it. From the moment the men settled into the routines of camp life, food became one of the few constants by which they measured each day, not because it brought comfort, but because it revealed patterns they were trained to notice. Bread had already challenged their expectations, and coffee had quietly reshaped their sense of limitation. Yet it was the repeated presence of meat that created the deepest sense of contradiction, because it clashed directly with everything they had experienced during the war. Before their capture, meat had become increasingly rare, reduced to memory rather than substance, replaced by substitutes that carried little resemblance to the real thing. It was associated with scarcity, with ration cards, and with careful calculation, not with routine or predictability. Even when it appeared, it was measured precisely, distributed cautiously, and never taken for granted. Inside the American camps, however, the trays told a different story. Meat appeared not as a special provision, but as an ordinary part of the meal, placed alongside other items without comment or emphasis. Portions were consistent, neither exaggerated nor withheld, and nothing in the routine suggested that this was an exception or a temporary allowance. At first, the men reacted with the same restraint they had learned to apply to every unfamiliar detail. They ate slowly, watching for reactions that never came, and observing whether the routine would change once attention was drawn to it. No warnings were issued, no limits announced, and no adjustments followed their cautious behavior. What unsettled them most was not the quantity, but the regularity. Meat returned the next day, and the day after that, appearing with the same quiet consistency that had begun to define life inside the camp. There was no indication that supplies were being conserved, and no effort was made to disguise the routine as something temporary. As they moved through the camp later in the day, carrying out assigned tasks and settling into familiar rhythms, the presence of meat remained in their thoughts in a way that surprised them. It had not been introduced as a gesture, nor framed as a privilege tied to compliance. It simply existed, treated as unremarkable by those who controlled the system. For men accustomed to reading authority through restriction, this absence of control signals created a subtle tension. They had learned to survive by anticipating loss, by recognizing the moment when something would be taken away, and by adjusting behavior accordingly. Here, those instincts offered no guidance. By the time the next meal arrived, expectations had begun to shift, not because understanding had replaced uncertainty, but because repetition made denial impossible. Meat appeared again, unchanged and unexplained, reinforcing the sense that captivity in this place would continue to challenge assumptions formed under entirely different conditions. In that early stage, the men did not yet question what this detail meant in a broader sense. They simply noted it quietly and carefully as another sign that life inside the American camps followed rules they had not been taught and patterns they could not yet interpret. Many people who enjoy these stories watch on television. Subscribing helps make sure the next story appears automatically. As the days passed, the presence of meat stopped being a single observation and began to form a pattern that the men could not ignore. because repetition carried more weight than explanation ever could. What at first seemed unusual gradually revealed itself as routine, appearing on trays with the same quiet regularity as bread and coffee, neither announced nor disguised, simply present. The prisoners began to observe the process more carefully, not out of curiosity, but out of habit, because habit had long been their most reliable means of survival. They noticed how the meals were prepared and distributed, how the portions remained consistent, and how no visible effort was made to limit or adjust what was being served. The absence of variation unsettled them more than excess ever could. In other places they had known, the appearance of something valuable was always accompanied by tension, by warning, or by an understanding that it would soon be withdrawn. Here, no such signal existed. Meat appeared without explanation, returned without interruption, and remained unaffected by attention or restraint. Some of the men began to compare days quietly, noting that the routine did not change with time or circumstance. Whether the weather shifted, work assignments varied, or new groups arrived, the meals followed the same structure. This consistency made it increasingly difficult to dismiss the presence of meat as temporary or symbolic. The guards offered no clarification. They stood nearby, observed without comment, and allowed the routine to continue without reaction. Their behavior provided no clues, no confirmation, and no denial. The system did not respond to being watched. For the prisoners, this lack of response forced a subtle internal adjustment. They had learned to expect fluctuation, to anticipate scarcity even in moments of provision, and to prepare themselves for loss. Here, those instincts proved unreliable. The pattern did not break under scrutiny, and no consequence followed acceptance. Over time, hesitation gave way to cautious acknowledgement. The men no longer waited for the moment when the routine would change, because each repeated meal reinforced the same message without stating it openly. Meat was not an exception. It was part of the structure. This realization did not bring comfort. It brought uncertainty of a different kind, because it challenged the framework through which they had understood captivity. If something so scarce elsewhere could be ordinary here, then other assumptions might also prove unreliable. As the pattern solidified, the men found themselves adjusting not through understanding, but through exposure. Repetition replaced explanation, and familiarity replaced suspicion, even as the underlying question remained unanswered. By the end of the second week, the presence of meat no longer drew attention at the tables. It was accepted quietly, not because it made sense, but because it had never failed to appear. In a system defined by consistency rather than correction, that was reason enough. As repetition continued to shape daily life inside the camp, the presence of meat gradually lost its ability to provoke immediate doubt, not because it had been explained or justified, but because the men were forced to adjust to a reality that no longer aligned with the expectations they had carried into captivity. What once demanded constant attention slowly became part of a routine that unfolded without disruption, absorbing suspicion through sheer consistency. The men found themselves approaching meals with fewer calculations than before, even though the uncertainty had never fully disappeared. Portions were taken, eaten, and set aside with growing familiarity as the effort required to remain cautious day after day began to outweigh the perceived risk of acceptance. Habit replaced vigilance, not out of trust, but out of exhaustion. This shift was subtle and rarely acknowledged openly. It appeared in the way conversations during meals became less restrained, and in how attention drifted away from the trays toward other aspects of the day. The meat, once a focal point of concern, became simply another element of the routine, present without drawing comment or reaction. For some prisoners, this predictability offered a quiet sense of stability, not comfort, but a reduction in the mental strain that had accompanied constant anticipation. For others, it produced a deeper unease, as the absence of scarcity made time feel slower, stretching days into one another without the urgency that hardship had once imposed. What unsettled many was not the presence of meat itself, but what it suggested about the system that allowed it. Scarcity had been a defining feature of survival elsewhere, a signal of control that shaped behavior and reinforced authority. Here, that signal was missing, replaced by a steadiness that did not fluctuate in response to behavior or observation. As days turned into weeks, the routine continued unchanged, reinforcing the same quiet message without ever stating it directly. The meals did not respond to restraint or acceptance, and no effort was made to test limits or provoke reaction. The system remained indifferent to scrutiny. In this environment, expectation itself began to shift. The men no longer waited for the routine to break, because repetition had taught them that nothing would follow. Meat appeared, was eaten, and disappeared from attention, not because it had lost meaning, but because it had become reliable. Yet understanding never replaced uncertainty. The men still did not know why this was allowed, or how long it would continue. They only knew that it did, and that this consistency demanded a different kind of adaptation than deprivation ever had. By the time this realization settled, the routine had already reshaped behavior in quiet ways. The presence of meat no longer challenged endurance. It challenged assumptions, forcing the men to confront a captivity that did not announce itself through loss, but through the steady absence of it. What made the presence of meat increasingly difficult to interpret was not the food itself, but the behavior of those who controlled the system, because authority, as these men had known it throughout the war, had always revealed itself through restriction, correction, and visible enforcement. In the American camps, none of these signals appeared in response to a detail that should have triggered control. The guards were present at every meal, standing nearby, moving between tables, and observing the routine with a calm consistency that never shifted into intervention. They did not comment on portions, did not react to hesitation, and did not adjust the routine when attention lingered on the trays. Their presence remained steady, neutral, and deliberately uneventful. In other environments, the continued availability of something valuable would have prompted limits or explanation, if only to remind prisoners of their position. Here, nothing suggested that meat was being treated as a resource that required management. It was distributed without ceremony, accepted without acknowledgement, and left without consequence. This absence of restriction forced the prisoners to confront a reality they had not prepared for. They had learned to read authority through visible signals, to recognize when allowance would be followed by withdrawal, and to adapt behavior accordingly. Without those signals, their familiar instincts offered no guidance. Some men responded by regulating themselves strictly, limiting their portions not because they were instructed to, but because restraint felt safer than assumption. Others gradually accepted the routine as it presented itself, not through trust, but through fatigue, as the effort required to remain suspicious day after day became unsustainable. The guards did not respond to either approach. They neither rewarded restraint nor punished acceptance. Their behavior did not shift from one meal to the next, and no pattern emerged that could be interpreted as a test. The consistency itself became the only message available. In this environment, control did not depend on force or constant correction. It relied on repetition and predictability. allowing routine to shape behavior without ever declaring itself as authority. The system did not demand obedience through fear. It expected adaptation through exposure. For men accustomed to defining captivity through deprivation, this form of authority required a different kind of endurance. It offered nothing to resist and nothing to endure in the familiar sense, leaving only the quiet task of adjusting expectations that no longer applied. By continuing without restriction, the system placed responsibility back onto the prisoners themselves, forcing them to navigate daily life without clear boundaries. In doing so, it reshaped their understanding of captivity, not through loss or punishment, but through a structure that refused to behave as expected. As the routine continued without interruption, the presence of meat gradually lost its ability to provoke attention, not because it had been explained or justified, but because repetition reshaped behavior more effectively than instruction ever could. What had once felt impossible to understand slowly became part of the background of daily life, absorbed into mornings that unfolded in the same way, day after day, without deviation. The men no longer studied their trays as closely as they once had. Portions were taken, eaten, and set aside with a growing sense of familiarity, even though the underlying uncertainty had never fully disappeared. The effort required to remain vigilant, to question every detail, and to anticipate sudden loss began to fade, replaced by habits formed through consistency rather than confidence. This shift altered how time itself was experienced inside the camp. Days no longer felt defined by moments of tension or expectation, but by steady repetition that offered few points of distinction. Meals marked the passage of time, not because they carried meaning, but because they arrived reliably, anchoring the day in a pattern that did not change. For some prisoners, this predictability eased the constant strain of anticipation that had defined earlier stages of captivity. It did not bring comfort or reassurance, but reduced the mental effort required to navigate each moment. For others, the absence of disruption made time feel heavier, as though days stretched into one another without clear boundaries or urgency. What remained unchanged was the lack of explanation. No one ever clarified why meat appeared so regularly, why supplies seemed unaffected by the demands of war, or why no effort was made to ration something that had once symbolized survival itself. The men learned to live with this absence of answers, just as they had learned to live with many other unanswered questions. Over time, the meat ceased to represent confusion or contradiction. It became part of the structure that governed daily life, shaping behavior quietly and without force. Meals were no longer moments of calculation or restraint, but transitions between parts of the day, and the food played its role without demanding thought. In this way, something ordinary came to define captivity more powerfully than hardship ever had, not through deprivation or punishment, but through a consistency that required adjustment rather than resistance. The routine did not test endurance in the familiar sense. It tested expectation. By the time the men fully recognized how deeply this repetition had influenced them, the routine was already established, woven into daily life so thoroughly that it no longer felt remarkable. The meat continued to appear, the days continued to pass, and captivity took on a form none of them had anticipated, shaped not by sudden cruelty, but by the quiet persistence of things that never changed. For the men held inside these camps, captivity in America was not shaped by dramatic deprivation or sudden acts of force, but by ordinary details that repeated themselves until they quietly altered expectation itself. The meat was one of those details, present at meals without explanation, unchanged by scrutiny, and unaffected by restraint. What unsettled the prisoners was not abundance, but consistency. They had learned to survive by anticipating loss, by assuming that anything given could be taken away without warning. Yet here, nothing was withdrawn and nothing was clarified. The routine continued without interruption, resisting every attempt to interpret it as temporary or conditional. Over time, the effort required to question each detail became heavier than the detail itself. Repetition replaced suspicion, not because understanding had been achieved, but because uncertainty had become familiar. The system did not demand acceptance. It produced it through exposure. In this environment, control did not announce itself through punishment or fear. It revealed itself through predictability, through days that unfolded without disruption, and through ordinary moments that carried no explanation but still carried influence. The prisoners were not asked to trust the system. They were required only to adapt to it. The meat was never meant to be understood as a gesture, a reward, or a strategy. It was simply there, part of a structure that governed daily life without commentary and shaped behavior without force. In a place where nothing dramatic happened, the ordinary proved powerful enough. And so, captivity took a form none of them had expected, defined not by sudden hardship, but by the quiet persistence of routines that refused to behave as the war had taught them they should. Thank you for spending this time here. If these quiet, true World War II stories matter to you, subscribing helps this channel continue.